The next morning came with a kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, watching Clara move through the house as if she were walking through a dream she didn't want to wake up from. The coffee brewed, the radio hummed softly in the background, but her eyes had changed. They were sharper now, more awake. She sat at the small table by the window, where sunlight spilled like honey over the wood, and opened the same journal she had begun the night before. Her handwriting looked calmer today, steadier. She wrote, "He is the sickness and I am the cure." It wasn't anger anymore. It was something quieter, colder. The kind of focus that comes when grief burns itself out and leaves behind only resolve. She folded the paper, slid it into a drawer, and began making calls. First to an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years, a lawyer named Meredith Shaw who used to work for victims' rights groups. Meredith's voice cracked when she recognized her. "Clara. My God, it's been decades." Clara just said softly, "I need to talk to you. About justice." By noon they met at a small diner just off the interstate. The place was nearly empty except for a trucker half asleep in his booth. Meredith looked older, gray strands framing a face that had seen too much of the system's failures. She took one look at Clara and said, "Tell me everything." And Clara did. Every detail, every bruise she remembered seeing, every night she'd been too afraid to call. Meredith's eyes darkened as she listened. "You know," she finally said, "we can't change the past. But sometimes, the past leaves evidence that can still speak." That sentence lit something inside Clara. Evidence. Maybe there was something, anything that could still be found. Meredith promised to reach out to some contacts, see if there were any surviving records, maybe old reports buried in archives. But Clara wasn't content to wait. That night, she drove back to her old neighborhood. The streets had changed, new shops, new faces, but the house still stood, now rented by strangers. She parked across the street, her fingers trembling slightly on the steering wheel. Through the window, she could still picture the way the curtains used to hang crooked, the sound of her mother humming in the kitchen before everything went wrong. She sat there for hours, the car engine off, the world outside dimming into twilight. She wasn't sure if she was trying to remember or trying to forget. A soft knock on her car window startled her. It was a young boy, maybe 12, with curious eyes. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Just visiting old ghosts," she said. The boy frowned, then nodded as if he understood, and walked away. That night, back in her apartment, she couldn't sleep. The moonlight spilled across the floor, silver and cold. She stood in front of the mirror, studying her reflection, the wrinkles, the scars of years on her face. For the first time, she didn't look away. "You survived," she whispered. "Now you finish it." Over the next few weeks, Clara became something between a ghost and a storm. She spent her days in libraries, archives, county offices, anywhere old records might be hidden. She found fragments, police reports half-filled, witness statements never followed up, and one name that kept appearing again and again, Evelyn Grant, a nurse from the local clinic where Clara's mother had once sought help. The report said she'd left town after the incident, never to return. But Clara tracked her down through old directories, found an address 2 states away. It was a small town, barely marked on the map, where the air smelled of rain and pine. Clara drove for hours, the radio silent, her mind replaying every moment she wished she'd forgotten. When she finally arrived, she found a small house at the edge of a forest. An old woman opened the door, frail, silver-haired, but her eyes sharp as broken glass. "You're Clara," she said before Clara even spoke. "I was wondering when you'd come." Clara froze. "You remember me?" Evelyn nodded. "I remember everything. I tried to speak back then, but they silenced me. Your father had power, friends in places that made truth inconvenient." The bitterness in her voice was years old but still fresh. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Because they threatened my life," Evelyn said. "And I was a coward. But maybe I can help you now." Evelyn led her inside, to a small wooden box hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside were photographs, old documents, and a tape recorder wrapped in cloth. "I kept these," she said, "because I knew someday the lies would burn themselves out, and someone would come looking for the ashes." Clara's hands shook as she held the box. This is proof." "It's the truth," Evelyn said. "Do what I couldn't." The drive back home was silent except for the sound of the box shifting slightly in the back seat, as if whispering to her that the past was finally ready to be heard. When she got home, she didn't open it right away. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and just stared at the night sky. The stars looked sharper than they ever had, and for a fleeting moment, she felt her mother beside her. The next morning she opened the box. The tape crackled when she pressed play. It was her mother's voice, soft, trembling, confessing what had happened, naming names, begging for someone to believe her. Clara cried like a child, not just because of the pain but because for the first time she wasn't crazy. The truth existed. It was real, tangible, undeniable. She made copies of everything and sent them to Meredith. Her friend called that evening, voice trembling. "Clara, this could reopen the case." But Clara wasn't thinking about courtrooms or headlines. She was thinking about balance. About how one man had poisoned generations with his cruelty. "I don't want justice," she said quietly. "I want peace." That night she dreamed of fire. Of the house she grew up in, burning clean through the memories that had haunted her. When she woke, she knew what she had to do. She dressed in black, packed the box back into her car, and drove to the old family cemetery at dawn. The sky was pale and empty. She found her mother's grave, a simple stone covered in moss. She knelt, brushed the leaves away and whispered, "It's over now, Mama." She buried the box there, deep in the earth, sealing the past where it belonged. But as she stood up, a shadow moved between the trees. Someone was watching her. She felt it before she saw him. A man in a long coat stepped forward. His eyes unfamiliar yet eerily knowing. "You've been digging where you shouldn't," he said. His voice was smooth, dangerous. "Your father's legacy doesn't end with him." Clara stared at him, unflinching. "Then it ends with me." The man's eyes were like cold mirrors, reflecting a darkness Clara thought she had buried with the box. The morning mist coiled around them as if the earth itself held its breath. She didn't flinch. For years she had lived in fear. Today she was only tired. "Who are you?" she asked. The man smiled faintly, a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Let's just say I work for people who still remember your father. He had unfinished business." His words hung heavy in the damp air, and for a moment, Clara felt that familiar childhood chill run down her spine, the echo of his shadow returning to claim what he'd left behind. She took a step back, her boots sinking into the wet earth. "He's dead," she said, "and his business died with him." The man tilted his head, as if amused. "You'd be surprised how deep the roots of corruption go, Miss Jensen. Your father planted them well." He turned, walking away slowly. "If I were you, I'd stop digging before those roots start choking you too." And then he was gone, swallowed by the trees. Clara stood there, breath trembling, the silence closing around her like a curtain. She wanted to believe it was over, that the box she had buried would be enough to silence the ghosts. But something inside her, the instinct that had kept her alive all these years, knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. By the time she drove back to her apartment, the city had begun to stir. She locked the door behind her, sat on the couch and stared at her hands. They were shaking. She opened her laptop and typed the man's description into a search bar, hoping for nothing, and yet within minutes she found a match. His name was Douglas Reeve, a private security consultant known for corporate cleanups, the kind that involved intimidation, data wiping, and sometimes worse. And his last known employer, a foundation tied to her father's former company. Her pulse quickened. The company was still alive, still operating under a new name, hiding behind charitable fronts and glossy PR. And if Reeve was here, it meant someone knew she'd found something. They wanted to scare her off. Maybe they thought she'd run. But Clara wasn't that woman anymore. That night, she met Meredith again, this time in the parking lot behind an old cinema that had long shut down. The air smelled of rain and dust. Meredith looked worried. "You shouldn't have gone back there," she said. "If someone's following you, they won't stop." Clara's voice was calm, too calm. "Then I won't stop either." She handed her friend a flash drive. "Make copies. Hide them. If anything happens to me, make sure the world sees what's on it." Meredith hesitated. "Clara, this isn't just about justice anymore. These people, they erase stories for a living." Clara smiled faintly. "Then let's make mine impossible to erase." Over the next few days, the city began to feel strange. She noticed cars that lingered too long outside her building, unfamiliar faces at the coffee shop. Once, when she came home, she found her front door slightly open. Nothing was missing, but the air inside felt disturbed, like someone had walked through her memories. She sat on the floor, shaking, holding a kitchen knife in one hand and the phone in the other, unsure which one made her feel safer. Sleep became impossible. Every sound felt amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the clock. But in that sleeplessness, something hardened inside her. She realized that survival wasn't enough anymore. Silence had protected her father's sins. Now her voice would destroy them. She began researching the company more deeply. The deeper she dug, the more rot she found. Offshore accounts, falsified charity records, bribes to local officials, even connections to missing persons reports. Every discovery was a spark, and Clara was slowly building a fire. One evening, she received an email from an anonymous address. The subject line read, "You're not alone." The message contained a single line. "I knew your mother. Meet me where the city meets the sea." There was an address below, a derelict dock on the outskirts of town. Clara hesitated for hours before going. The fog was thick that night, the kind that made the world feel smaller. She arrived just after midnight. A figure was waiting near the edge of the pier, hunched beneath a hood. "You came," the voice said. It was a woman's voice, older, brittle but strong. "Who are you?" Clara asked. The woman pulled back her hood. Her face was lined, but her eyes glowed with that strange light of someone who had seen too much. "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that your mother wasn't the only one. He hurt many women, Clara. Dozens. And they all disappeared quietly because no one wanted to believe them." Clara felt her stomach twist. "How do you know this?" The woman handed her a worn envelope. "Because I was one of them." Her hands trembled as she spoke. He was supposed to be a savior, philanthropist. But behind those closed doors, he was a monster. And everyone around him helped keep his sins clean. Inside the envelope were old photographs, letters, and a list of names. "These women deserve their stories back," the woman said. "You're the only one left who can give them that." Before Clara could say anything, the woman turned and vanished into the fog, leaving only the envelope in Clara's hands. Back home, Clara spread the papers across her table. The names, the faces, they weren't just ghosts anymore. They were a choir of silenced voices, and she was their echo. She realized the truth wasn't about her father anymore. It was about every life he had destroyed. The next day, she visited a local journalist, a young man named Adam Reyes, known for taking on dangerous stories. At first, he didn't believe her. But when she showed him the documents, his expression changed. "If this is real," he said quietly, "this could bring down people who've been untouchable for decades." Clara's eyes didn't waver. "Then let's start touching them." For weeks, they worked in secret, meeting in coffee shops, exchanging encrypted files, interviewing forgotten witnesses. Meredith helped from the shadows, feeding legal insights and protection measures. Slowly, the puzzle began to form. Clara wasn't just fighting her father's legacy now. She was exposing an entire system built on his corruption. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Adam's car was vandalized. Meredith received threatening calls. And one night, Clara came home to find a single photograph on her bed, a picture of her mother's grave, freshly disturbed. That image broke something inside her. Fear turned to fury, and fury turned to clarity. The message was simple: stop. But she had spent her whole life being told to stop. Stop crying, stop remembering, stop speaking. Not anymore. She picked up her phone and called Meredith. "I'm done hiding," she said. "They took everything from us. It's time I take it back." That night, she returned to the cemetery. The air was sharp, the trees whispering in the dark. She found the grave untouched. But beside it lay fresh footprints, large, heavy boots. She followed them deeper into the woods, her flashlight trembling. Then she saw him, Douglas Reeve, standing by a tree, smoking. "You really don't know when to quit," he said, flicking the cigarette away. "I learned from the best," Clara said coldly. "My father never quit either, not until he was buried in his own lies," Reeve smirked. "You think you can destroy a legacy with some papers and a few scared women?" He took a step closer. "Men like your father built empires on silence." Clara held her ground. "Then let's see what happens when the silence breaks." Before he could react, she pulled out her phone, showing him the screen. Live stream. Thousands watching. She had been broadcasting since the moment she arrived. "Say hello to the world," she whispered. His face froze, the smirk fading. The forest felt electric, alive with the hum of justice finally catching its prey. Reeve lunged forward, trying to grab the phone, but Clara stepped back. "It's too late," she said. "They've seen your face. They've heard your threats." He stopped, breathing hard, realizing he'd been outmaneuvered by a woman he thought he could scare. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air heavy with the weight of years of pain and defiance. Then Reeve turned and disappeared into the dark, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and the faint smell of smoke. Clara stood there, trembling but unbroken. The stream ended, and the notifications began flooding in. Messages, news alerts, journalists calling. The story was out now, and there was no turning back. When she got home, she sat in front of her mirror again. The same mirror from that first night. She looked older, yes, but stronger. She whispered to her reflection, "You started this for her. But now it's for all of them." Outside, the first light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, washing the night away. The days that followed were unlike any Clara had ever lived before. The story she had carried for decades was now everywhere. News sites, social media, podcasts, radio. Her father's name had become a synonym for everything rotten in the city's history. Politicians distanced themselves, companies erased logos overnight, and people whispered her name in awe and fear. Clara Jensen, the daughter who destroyed the monster. But for Clara, it didn't feel like victory. Felt like an aftermath. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from survivors, strangers, journalists. They all wanted something from her. Her voice, her quote, her strength. But inside she was hollow. She would walk through her apartment, touch the furniture, the walls, the small details of a life that suddenly felt borrowed. Justice had come, yes, but peace was nowhere to be found. One evening, Meredith came over with a bottle of wine. They sat in silence for a long while before Meredith spoke. "You did what no one else could, Clara. You burned down an empire of lies." Clara gave a small smile, weary but honest. "And yet, I still feel like I'm standing in the ashes." Meredith placed a hand on hers. "That's what healing feels like. Messy, low, but real." Clara nodded, but that night she dreamed again. Only this time her mother wasn't crying. She was standing in a field of tall grass, sunlight spilling through her hair, smiling. "You did it, my love," her mother whispered. "But remember, revenge is a storm. Don't live inside it forever." When Clara woke, her pillow was wet with tears. She decided to leave the city. Not to run, but to breathe. She packed a small suitcase, left her apartment key on the counter, and drove north. The radio played old songs from her childhood, and for the first time they didn't hurt. The road unfolded endlessly before her, like the life she had yet to live. Hours turned into days. She stopped in small towns, stayed in roadside inns, sometimes talking to strangers who didn't know her name. She liked that anonymity. One night, while staying near a quiet coastal village, she met a man in his 60s named Harold. He ran a small bookstore that smelled of salt and paper. He asked no questions about her past, and she offered no answers. But every evening they shared tea and talked about books, about poetry, about the strange ways people survive their own tragedies. Harold said something that stayed with her. Sometimes, healing isn't about forgetting what broke you. It's about learning to live with the crack, and still calling yourself whole. Clara smiled. For the first time she believed it. Weeks passed. She began volunteering at the local library, helping children read. There was something sacred in their laughter, something pure that reminded her what innocence sounded like. She felt her mother's spirit there, not haunting her anymore but guiding her. But one morning, as she was shelving books, she noticed a newspaper on the table. The headline made her blood run cold. Whistleblower Clara Jensen under investigation. It seemed the powerful weren't done fighting. The very system she had exposed was now trying to paint her as unstable, manipulative, even complicit. Her father's old allies were rising from the shadows again. For a long time she just stared at the paper, the words blurring. Then she laughed, softly but bitterly. "They never learn," she said under her breath. That night she sat down and wrote a letter. It wasn't to the world or to the press. It was to her mother. "Dear Mama," she wrote, "they're trying to bury me like they buried you. But they've forgotten something. You planted me deep enough to grow again." The next day she called Adam Reyes, the journalist who had helped her. "They're coming for me," she said simply. He sighed. "I know. They're desperate. But I've got something that might stop them." He explained that one of her father's former partners had agreed to come forward. A man who had everything to lose but couldn't carry the guilt any longer. "If we can get him on record," Adam said, "the story won't just survive, it'll become unbreakable." They arranged to meet that night at an old train yard on the edge of the city. Clara didn't like it, but she had no choice. She drove through the dark, the wind howling against her window. The yard was deserted, just the whisper of steel rails and the echo of her footsteps. Adam was already there, standing near a rusted freight car. "He's running late," he said. "You okay?" Before she could answer, the world exploded. A gunshot cracked through the night, then another. Adam shouted, pulling her behind the car. "Get down," he yelled. The shots echoed, metal ringing like bells. Clara's heart pounded, her breath ragged. Through the smoke, she saw figures moving, men in dark coats. "It's them," she whispered. Adam handed her a small flash drive. "Take this. It's everything. Run." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you." But he pushed her hard. "Clara, go." She ran, her feet pounding against gravel, bullets slicing the air behind her. The world was a blur of fear and adrenaline. She ducked behind a fence, crawled through the mud, and didn't stop until the sound of gunfire faded into the distance. When she finally looked back, flames were rising from the yard. She drove all night without knowing where she was going. Her hands were shaking, her mind replaying the gunshots again and again. By dawn, she found herself at the edge of a forest, the same one where she had buried the box. She parked, stepped out, and fell to her knees, gasping. "Why?" she cried into the silence. "When does it end?" But the forest only whispered back in the wind and leaves. She stayed there for hours, the flash drive clutched in her hand, the morning light filtering through the trees. When she finally stood up, her eyes were calm. She knew what she had to do. That evening, she checked into a motel and opened her laptop. She connected the flash drive and uploaded everything to multiple servers, sending copies to every major outlet she could find. And then she wrote one last message. "To those who think truth can be silenced, remember this. Every time you bury a story, it grows roots." She pressed send. The next morning, the headlines erupted again. This time the story couldn't be buried. Videos, files, confessions, it all came out. Names that had been untouchable for decades were suddenly exposed. The government opened investigations. Protests filled the streets. Her father's name became the symbol of a reckoning far greater than any she had imagined. But Clara didn't stay to watch. She left town quietly, leaving behind the phone, the laptop, everything. She drove until the roads turned to dirt and the noise of the world disappeared behind her. Weeks later, a woman matching her description was seen near the coast, walking barefoot along the shoreline at sunrise. Some said she had gone mad. Others said she was finally free. No one really knew. Months passed. The world moved on, but her name remained. A whisper, a legend, a ghost in the public conscience. Schools taught her story. Survivors wrote her letters that would never be delivered. And then, one evening in a quiet coastal bookstore, Harold looked up from his counter and froze. A woman had just walked in, older now, her hair streaked with silver. She smiled gently and said, "Do you still have that poetry book you promised me?" Harold's eyes softened. "You came back." She nodded. "I needed to finish something." She sat near the window where the sea wind brushed her face. From her bag she pulled out a journal, the same one she had started long ago. She opened it to the last page and wrote, "Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the final act of strength." She closed the book, exhaled slowly and smiled. For the first time her heart felt light. Outside, the sun dipped into the sea, painting the horizon gold. The storm was finally over. But deep in the soil of that old cemetery, beneath her mother's grave, something stirred, not in menace but in peace. The earth that had once held her pain now held her truth. And somewhere far above, a whisper drifted on the wind. Her mother's voice, soft and eternal. "You did it, my brave girl. You turned our grief into light." Clara looked up at the sky through the window, her reflection merging with the fading sunlight. The waves whispered back, endless and calm. She smiled once more, the kind of smile that only comes from surviving everything meant to break you. And then she whispered, almost to herself, "It's over now." Outside, the tide came in, erasing footprints from the sand.